Hello, everyone. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. It's really good to have you with us today for what I know is going to be maybe a difficult but very important conversation, and I don't want to waste any time. So let me bring on my friend and colleague, Jean Marie Nevada.
Hello, Liz Owen. I am always happy to see you.
And you, my friend.
Now, we do have a really good show today, so let's get to work and I will see you later probably. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and ella, and I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we get to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion, and this week we are commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day. I will tell you that this morning I get up very early in the morning so I can do my exercise, and I was doing my workout and I had the news on. And I heard about something that happened in Tennessee last week. On January 10th, the McMinn School Board in Tennessee voted to ban this book. This is Art Spiegelman's Mouse. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, graphic novelist, who wrote about his family's, a version of his family's narrative in the Holocaust. And it was banned because it was considered to be too offensive, too much, and even one school board member calling it indoctrination. So we are in some really, really dark times as we move towards Holocaust denial. Which means we need to tell these stories even more, and we need to be even more assertive. And one of the things that we try to do are elevate LGBTQ stories. I have been trying to learn more over the years about the roles of LGBTQ people and what happened to them in the Holocaust, and came across an article that appeared in Time magazine last year. And as I read it, I thought, I didn't know most of this, which made me very excited. And so we reached out to the writer. So this week, our article is from Time magazine, and it's called Why It Took Decades for LGBTQ Stories to be Included in Holocaust History. And I am really, really excited to introduce Andrea Carlo, who is a journalist originally from Milan, has lived in Ireland and England, has degrees from so many universities that it actually just intimidates me, Andrea. Oxford, Cambridge, you're working on your PhD, and you have been studying Holocaust history. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. And I'm really, truly very honored to be able to talk to you and to PFLAG about this research that is so dear to me and that I really want to share with the world.
As I said, when I read your article, I got so excited. I emailed Liz and I said, we have to track this writer down. It was such a fascinating article because it was so much more expansive than what I was used to reading. So what brought you to this work? What put you on this path of this type of study?
So actually at the start, it was almost coincidental in a sense. It was 3 years ago. I was just starting my career as a freelance journalist. And this new beginning in the professional side of my life coincided with my coming out. So a kind of personal epiphany in a sense. And this triggered a real newfound interest in topics linked to LGBT history. Now, it was February 2019, and February is LGBT History Month in the UK. And I remember I sat back and thought to myself, why is it that we never really hear of the stories of the Holocaust LGBT victims? So I went down this sort of rabbit hole, and I came across at the start Pierre Sell's memoir, which I talk about in this article. For those of you who may not know, Pierre Sell was one of the first survivors to openly share his experiences of being persecuted by the Nazis for being gay. His story really touched me in a way that's almost hard to describe. And from that moment onwards, I felt a vocation almost to share his experience as widely as possible and also that of others like him.
Thank you. And one of the things you sort of mentioned very early in the article is that you say there's been a systemic process of persecution and willful suppression of the stories of LGBT victims of the Holocaust. So for people who have not read the article, can you talk a little bit about how that has shown up, what you meant by that statement, and what people are missing often when we learn about the Holocaust in general?
Yeah, of course. So to very briefly summarize the basic overall history In the early 20th century, sex between men was technically illegal in Germany, according to a law called Paragraph 175. However, it was very rarely enforced in the early 20th century. And actually, there was a bubbling gay life in the urban underground cities like Berlin and Cologne. And you had certain organizations and magazines with tens of thousands of members and subscribers, to the point that Germany, during the years of the Weimar Republic, was described as experiencing a kind of gay renaissance, or as being a gay Eden, in a sense. Now, the Nazis, who believed the gay people were a threat to the racial and moral purity of the folk, the German people, persecuted them. Initially, they started off by shutting down all organizations and their sources of kinship. Then they took paragraph 175, modified it to make it a felony, and changed it so that it would include any kind of same-sex intimacy. You've got to consider this could even mean looking at someone the wrong way. It wasn't, no longer just about sex. It was about any form of homosexual inclinations. And then ultimately they deported gay men to concentration camps, where they faced some of the worst kinds of torture, abuse, and even conversion therapy experiments. The Nazis really were pioneers of conversion therapy. But after 1945, this is the real interesting thing, is that gay victims were not liberated as survivors, but rather as criminals. Paragraph 175 remained in place both in East and West Germany, and some gay men, believe it or not, were even reincarcerated. So from a legal perspective, they were essentially just as persecuted as under the Third Reich. And as you can expect, following on from this, homophobic attitudes that really persisted meant that Holocaust scholarship was very slow to pick up on gay victims' experiences, often omitting them from general histories. And really, even in the 80s, when the gay victims of the Holocaust were finally beginning to be recognized, they were still met with opposition from various institutions. Like in Dachau, the committee, it took them 10 years to agree just on having a memorial to LGBTQ victims. So overall, we just see that for gay Holocaust survivors, there really was no justice for many decades after the war.
I have to admit to you, I was sort of surprised, I was very surprised when I read that, because more contemporary Germany, particularly Berlin, is known as such a gay mecca, frankly. It just seemed so strange to me, because it wasn't until 1994 that paragraph 175 was actually taken away, and then compensation didn't happen until 2017. So it just seemed to fly in the face of so much of, I think, of what we saw on the surface. Why do you think it took so long to undo that particular law?
Yeah, so really, I would say that it was a double whammy of homophobia and lingering Nazi-era legislation. So the West German government in this time, especially under Adenauer and the Christian Democrats, maintained very conservative social values. And for that reason, gay men were still perceived as a threat. So not only did paragraph 175 remain, but also the Nazi-era modifications were kept until 1969. So you can see 100,000 gay men being arrested for homosexuality between 1945 and 69. And as you yourself said, the law was only struck down in 94 after reunification, and the gay victims of the Holocaust were pardoned first in 2002, and then all victims of paragraph 175 finally were deemed to receive compensation and reparations in 2017, although you've got to consider that many of them would have passed away by then.
Yeah. Your article mentions the pink lists. And so this was, they were maintained by West German officials. Could you explain to people what they were and how they were used to continue victimizing many of these victims who had then come out of these horrible experiences?
Yeah, so the pink lists, or in German rosa Listen, were essentially private documents that were held by the police to record men suspected of being gay. This was initially a Nazi-era practice, but the incredible thing is it was carried over into the West German police force really until the 80s. And it could include anyone who was suspected of being even in touch with someone who was a paragraph 175 suspect or criminal, so to speak. And people who were on these lists often risked serious repercussions for their careers, their public standing. Authorities could be notified, employers. So it was a real sign of a systematic persecution that just did not end in 1945. We don't see this turning point. It was just a continuation of the same kind of policies that the Nazis had implemented, perhaps with less violence, but still with the same kind of insidiousness.
Yeah, and I feel like when you talk about some of those experiences, these lists, this tracking, people being constantly re-victimized, we see this has happened in other places, including here in the United States. And I think there really is still a moment of shock when people find out that this really happened and it didn't happen that long ago. One of the things that I think was especially fascinating about your article is that you did acknowledge that there seems to be less research, less information, less scholarship on the experiences of, for example, lesbians in the Holocaust and people who are intersex. I actually remember the first time I went to the Holocaust Museum in DC when they had the display of the different stars. I saw the black one and I thought, wow, it was included. Somebody acknowledged it here, but it seems to be very few and far between. So why do you think there is less focus on the experiences of lesbians? And you also did acknowledge people who are intersex. Is it a lack of scholarship? Is it that we don't have the records? Is it something else entirely?
Yeah, so it's a mixture of factors. I would say when it comes to lesbian women, there's the initial, the basic fact that except in Austria, in paragraph 129 of the Penal Code, but then was replaced with paragraph 175 after Anschluss, female same-sex relationships were not technically criminalized by the Nazis. Really, the Nazis saw women as being extremely important for childbearing, as handmaids in a sense. So were initially less concerned with homosexuality among them. So for this reason, there was an underlying belief for many decades, even after scholarship had picked up on the Holocaust's gay victims, that really lesbian women just weren't targeted or persecuted. And indeed, in 2008, there was even controversy in Berlin when a memorial to the Holocaust's gay victims would have included a commemoration to lesbians, and that generated a real public furore. But now what we do know, thanks to wonderful research of scholars such as Claudia Schottman and Laurie Marhofer, is that while lesbian women may not have been systematically and explicitly persecuted in the same way as gay men, they were arrested often on other grounds, such as for their asociality, so to speak, or for being political dissidents. And then you've got to consider they were living in a climate which really threatened them. So lesbian organizations, magazines such as Die Freundin, sorry, my German pronunciation isn't great, but these were huge institutions at the start of the 20th century. The Nazis shut them down. So, of course, yes, they weren't arrested in the same way as gay men were for paragraph 175, but still, the Nazis found other ways of discriminating against them, and they were, I would say, definitely victims of the Holocaust. And when it comes to intersex individuals, unfortunately, there's a real lacuna in the scholarship on this. I've been trying to dig, and there is truly very little. What we do know, however, is that intersex individuals were often very tragically used for the most barbaric kinds of medical experiments, especially at the hands of the infamous, the angel of death, Josef Mengele.
Yeah, there were some very scary things going on. I keep coming back to a piece of your article that really had me thinking a lot and trying to understand what happened. And we started talking about this a little bit in the beginning of the show, which was there has been historically some resistance to the inclusion of the stories of LGBT people who were in the Holocaust. I want to talk a little bit about why we think that might have happened or why that still happens in some cases. I mean, do you think it is outright homophobia? Was it a sense that it was distracting from the largest group of victims, obviously, who are people who were Jewish? Is it something else? And do you feel that this is getting better now? Do you feel that more people are speaking about this? Certainly, I think I've seen more about it, but still, to your point, there's a lot of gaps in this scholarship too, and gaps in acknowledgement.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, interestingly, this is something that I have been dealing with today specifically because I wrote an article for Euronews on how Europe today is commemorating the LGBT victims of the Holocaust. I would say that one of the main reasons really was rampant and lingering homophobia. The fact that gay inmates, the pink triangles, they often, not all of them carried the pink triangle, but many of them did, were perceived essentially as just being sexual deviants, and were often ostracized from by other prisoners. I mean, in 1960, you have the mayor of Dachau saying that basically comparing gay men to criminals. So, and also you have another thing that's often not spoken about is the fact that until research started catching up on this chapter of Holocaust history, there was often this association of the Nazis with homosexuality themselves. So they were seen as those promoting homosexuality, and this may have been due to the fact that, harrowingly, a lot of soldiers and guards in the camp may have sexually abused other prisoners. So there may have been this association of homosexuality with the Nazi Party. Also, you have Ernst Röhm, who was gay, but this perceived notion carried on to the point where gay people were not seen as the victims in some circles, but even as the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And then leading on from that, you really have the fact that historians were just incredibly slow to pick up on this area of history and to document it. I mean, you have the definitive volume on Holocaust history from the 1960s, William Scherer's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, over 1,000 pages, a huge volume, not a single reference to Holocaust gay victims. They were completely omitted. So, following on from that, it's clear why Dr. Klaus Müller stated that the gay men weren't the forgotten victims of the Holocaust, as is often said. They were actually the suppressed, the silenced victims. And I would say now things have definitely improved. I mean, just today I was talking to a French organization called Les Oubliés de la Mémoire, and they are campaigning for the recognition and acknowledgement of gay Holocaust victims. And they said that the reception they receive is overwhelmingly positive, and that, for instance, they have been giving statements to the Council of Europe. The UN, for instance, now includes in its Holocaust Remembrance Day statement, has included the gay victims amongst the list of victims. But still, there's a lot to be done. I mean, you have a report from OSCE from last year, which shows that in many countries in Europe, really there is no education in primary, secondary schools or even universities on the other victims of the Holocaust, so to speak. So there's a lot of work to be done, but overall I am optimistic because of the fact that recently there's been a reawakening in scholarship that is now permeating popular history and public life.
I found your point about Rise and Fall of the Third Reich fascinating. I read it in college. I still have my copy. And I actually, after I read your article, found myself pulling it out and sort of realizing all of a sudden that this huge book that very much was considered to be the definitive history never had anything. And I think at the time that I read it, it was certainly not centered on my radar. And now looking at it, you think this is an enormous omission from it. So sort of bringing this up to the present and all of the very relevant connections we are seeing now. Genocide, unfortunately, did not end with the Holocaust. We've seen it many times since World War II. Uganda, Poland, Chechnya, we are seeing it against particularly gay men. As you look at some of these examples of state-sponsored attacks on the LGBTQ community, do you see history starting to repeat itself in this sense? Knowing what you saw in terms of the development of how this came to be, how this sort of portion of the Holocaust happened. So are you seeing some of these signs, some of these symbols reappearing as we look around the globe? And my part B to that is, what should the everyday person be doing about this? I mean, obviously we don't have, all of us have global influence, but I do feel that there are conversations that probably need to be had that are not happening. So first, do you see some things happening that are dangerous signs? And what would you suggest people do?
Yeah, so Jean-Marie, you said it well yourself. I wouldn't even say that history is repeating itself. I would say that what happened under the Nazis is still our present. I mean, you've got to consider that 70 countries in the world still outlaw homosexuality. And you have state-sponsored attacks and concentration camps in Chechnya. You have gay men forcing to choose between basically between prison and between castration in Iran. You have, and even in Europe, in Eastern Europe, we have a rollback of rights in countries like Poland, where we're seeing the creation, we've seen in the past few years, the creation of these LGBT-free zones, and taken huge parts of the country. And what I would say is that even here in countries, so, you're in the States, I'm in Italy, West European countries or Western, countries in the Western hemisphere that are seen as having progressed when it comes to LGBT rights. We really can't take this for granted at all. I mean, just the example of what happened in Germany in the early 20th century is a sign of that. I mean, the Weimar Republic was a period and it seemed like a blossoming in when it comes to LGBT related issues, and then it was just completely reversed by the Nazis, and it stayed that way for until the 90s. So what I would say is that we collectively have a responsibility not to be complacent, and I think we can do that. First of all, it starts with just informing ourselves of what is happening in the world, even what is happening within our countries. In Italy, the Zan bill that was voted down last year. In the US, in Florida, this whole "Don't Say Gay" bill that frighteningly reminds me of Section 28 in the UK that was kept from the 80s to 2003, that basically really stifled and ruined the lives of so many LGBT youths. And so I would say we need to inform ourselves, and we need to be active and vocal. We need to share our opinions, raise our voices, campaign, petition. It sounds trite, but it's all we can really do. And it's
Yes, I don't think it's trite at all. I think when we look at many of these examples, we are looking at a pattern of silence, of looking the other way, of thinking it can't possibly happen here, and it does. And I think your point to pay attention, to actually raise these issues and finally say this is wrong and this shouldn't be happening, becomes so critical. Liz mentioned that we do have a question from somebody who is watching. And Liz, I was wondering if you could actually pop back into the feed. And here's the question for us. It is that I understand a few countries built memorial sculptures to the LGBTQ victims, Holocaust victims. But can you remind anyone of which countries have done this, and has the US, to the best of your knowledge?
Yes. So if I'm not wrong, it's 12 countries. At least that was according to an article I recently read by Jake Newsom, who, if you haven't checked out his work, he's an excellent scholar when it comes to LGBT Holocaust history. And the US has, in San Francisco, there is a memorial. And you have a memorial in Sydney. The first was in Mauthausen in Austria in 1984. And then in Amsterdam, the Homer Monument, in Bologna in Italy. So you do have various monuments in different countries. And when it comes to specifically lesbian victims, I read that some activists had campaigned for a memorial in the Ravensbrück camp, which was a women-only camp. But if I'm not wrong, and I don't quote me on this, but it hasn't been erected yet. But yes, there are various memorials, and even memorials to the victims themselves specifically. So Pierre Selle, for instance, in Toulouse and Paris, has plaques and streets named after him. So yeah, thankfully now in the past 20, 30 years, we have seen examples of these memorials propping up.
Could you, for people who are interested in this, and certainly I think there's so much that we still don't know, or there's so much that a lot of us were certainly never taught, could you suggest, you mentioned one of the scholars who does this work, would you suggest some scholars, writers, historians, or even institutions that are doing good work in this space that you think people should be paying attention to? We always like to leave people with something to actually do, places to look. And do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real treasure chest of sources and really interesting articles, books on this topic. You have some truly great scholars who recently have been doing the groundwork on this. And of the big names, the first I can think of is Jeffrey Giles. He lives in Florida, and he was actually one of the first academics to approach this topic in a time where really it wasn't fashionable to do so, and doing so in an academic context could put you in a bit of trouble, so to speak. So his work has really shed light on the complexities and nuances of the narcissist approach to the persecution of gay people. And I actually had the sort of the honor of talking to him a while ago. He's truly a wonderful scholar, and I definitely recommend even just getting in touch with him. Even though maybe I don't know if he'd be happy with if hundreds of people starting messaging, but he's a lovely guy. So I would recommend even just popping him a message. And he has a great lecture I'd recommend on YouTube. It's from 2016, Claremont McKenna College. He really goes through gay Holocaust victims' lives with such incredible detail. So he's one of the top names, I would say. But there are others. I mentioned Jake Newsom. He's part of a younger generation of LGBTQ Holocaust scholars. He has a great article called "Liberation Was Only for Others," and you can find that on his website, for instance. Wisden Clayton is really shedding some light on the experiences of other queer victims of the Holocaust, so non-binary, trans, and lesbian women. And in terms of lesbian women, you have Claudia Schottman, as I mentioned. You have Samuel Huneke. So you do have fewer, but you do have some great scholars when it comes to that. But I'm sorry, I've been bombarding you with tons of names of academics.
I've been writing them down as you've been going.
I actually think that a lot of great research can really be done just by going to the archives and the institutional websites. I mean, you have some great material at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, at the Holocaust Encyclopedia, the Jewish Virtual Library. And then one thing I would definitely recommend is actually reading the survivors' testimonies. So PSL's book, it's a short book. I read it in an afternoon, and it's life-changing. It's, apart from being just a wonderful book in itself, I think it's a great work of literature, but it really, it's so powerful, and it connects with you in such a visceral kind of way that I'd recommend it for everyone, even people who aren't interested in this topic per se. And then, of course, you have the first biography of a gay Holocaust survivor, being that of Josef Kohut, under the pseudonym of Heinz Hager, which is The Man with the Pink Triangle, published in 1972.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
Of material.
Thank you. And I can only hope that we're going to find some of these books in people's libraries sometime soon, because it seems that is a challenge. Andrea, thank you so very much for being with us. I was so excited to speak with you. I have my reading list now. It is now quite long. I really appreciate what you're doing. And I so appreciate the perspective that you're able to bring of both what happened, but even more importantly, in some respects, what happened after the Holocaust and what those stories look like. And I think we're still hearing a lot of those. And I think it's because of the work of people like you that we're going to hear even more of those stories. So thank you so much for being with us. And I hope we will get to have you back to talk about some other issues again.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to you and to Liz, and really for giving me this platform, in a sense, to share these stories, because as I was saying, especially when it comes to people like PSL, throughout their life, they never really had any opportunities to openly share their experiences, and towards the end of their life a little bit, but it was meager and small, and I feel this real strong sense of duty towards them, and using my platform as a journalist to share their stories. And I had the great fortune of being able to meet his son Antoine Sel, who has provided his blessing on research on PSL. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We will definitely have you back to continue this conversation. Thank you for everything, Andrea.
Thank you.
Well, we need to wrap up once again. A couple of quick things. First, Andrea actually mentioned the Don't Say Gay bill. You definitely want to be with us next week. We are going to be talking about what is happening in Florida with Nadine Smith from Equality Florida. It is going to be a great conversation. I am also going to say that if you'd like to do something amazing this week, why don't you consider donating a book to your local library or maybe your local school library? You want to be revolutionary? Donate a book. That might be a great way to get started. But until next week, I will remind you, if you need help, please visit us at pflag.org. And we will leave you the way we leave everybody every single week, reminding you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. And if you haven't done it yet, get vaccinated, get boosted, and wear the proper mask. We want to be together soon. Thank you to Andrea, our guest. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we will see you again next week on Something to Talk About Live. Have a good week, everybody.